Good day, I'm Jaya Marie A. Espina, and I'm going to report Article 1262, Article 1263, Article 1264, Article 1266, and Article 1268 of Section 2, Loss of the Thing due.
Hi everyone, I'm Nabib Grace Logica. I'm going to report the generic rule of Article 1262, the effect of fortuitous loss in the generic obligation, Article 1265, Article 1267, and Article 1269 of Section 2, Loss of the Thing Due.
So the very first article in Section 2, Loss of the Thing, is Article 1262. It states here that an obligation which consists in the delivery of a determinate thing shall be extinguished if it should be lost or destroyed without the fault of the debtor and before he has incurred in delay. When by law or stipulation the obligation is liable even for fortuitous events, the loss of the thing does not extinguish the obligation, and he shall be responsible for damages. The same rule applies when the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk. So, meaning in Article 1262 daw, if the very first paragraph, if mawala ang specific thing, the obligation is extinguished. But take note that it should be without the fault of the debtor or before naanay nahitabong delay. But also, it states here sa Article 1262 sa second paragraph na nga um, ang specific thing, if mawala, the obligation daw is not extinguished. If first, it is, or when the law provides man ang first, or stipulation, which means nga naa daw sa kontrata between the parties. Then, the third one is when the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk. So, the example scenario of Article 1262 is when um, Fred promised to deliver to Jay a particular bicycle on December 31, 2020, but the said bicycle was lost on December 25, 2020 because of a typhoon. Take note that the loss was without the fault of Fred, and he is not in delay. So, ang obligation ni Fred is extinguished.
The generic rule of Article 1262 is that the obligation to deliver a determinate thing is extinguished if it should be lost or destroyed. In order that an obligation may be extinguished by the loss of the thing, um, the following requisites must be present. So there are 8 requisites that must be present. First is when the law so provides, when the stipulation so provides, when the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk, when the loss of the thing occurs with the fault of the debtor, and when the loss of the thing occurs after the debtor has incurred in delay, when the debtor promised to deliver the same thing to 2 or more persons who do not have the same interest, when the obligation is to deliver a specific thing. Oh no, it, sorry. When the obligation is to deliver a generic thing. And lastly, when the obligation to deliver a specific thing arises from a crime.
So the second article in Section 2 is Article 1263. It states here that in an obligation to deliver a generic thing, the loss or destruction of anything of the same kind does not extinguish the obligation. So, ang pasabot ingani, for example, Anne bound himself to give 50 shares to Louis. However, all of these were lost through an earthquake. So, ang tungutan na liable ba gihapon si Anne. Si Anne. So, Ang answer is yes. Why? Because the object of the obligation are generic things.
So, effect of the fortuitous clause in a generic obligation. It states here that if the obligation is generic in the sense that the object thereof is designated merely by its class or genus without any particular designation or physical segregation from all others of the same class, the loss or destruction of anything of the same kind, even without the debtor's fault and before he has incurred in delay, will not have the effect of extinguishing the obligation. The rule is based on the principle that the genus of a thing can never perish. An obligation to pay money is generic, therefore, it is not excused by fortuitous loss by any specific property of the debtor.
The third article is Article 1264. It states here that the courts shall determine whether, under the circumstances, the partial loss of the object of the obligation is so important as to extinguish the obligation. So, for example, in this is John obliged himself to deliver to James a motorcycle with a plate number down na ABC 123. Subsequently, ang two tires o ang engines daw were lost because of a typhoon. So, in this case, the courts shall determine if the loss of the two tires and its engines is so important as to extinguish the obligation. So, again, the general rule of this article is that partial loss of the object of the obligation does not extinguish the obligation. But there is also an exemption, okay? So the exemption is that when the court determined that the partial loss of the object of the obligation is so important as to extinguish the obligation.
So, Article 1265 states that whenever the thing is lost in the possession of the debtor, it shall be presumed that the loss was due to his fault, unless there is proof to the contrary, and without to the prejudice to the provisions of Article 1165. This presumption does not apply in case of earthquake, flood, storm, or other natural calamity. So, the article establishes a disputable presumption of fault whenever the thing to be delivered is lost in the possession of the debtor. This presumption is reasonable because the debtor who has the custody and care of the thing can easily explain the circumstances of the loss. The creditor has no duty to show that the debtor was at fault. Under the third paragraph of Article 1165, the obligor who is not at fault is still liable in case he is guilty of delay or has promised to deliver the same thing to two or more persons who has who who do not have the same interest. In case of natural calamities, the presumption of the fault does not apply. Lack of fault on the part lack of fault on the part of the debtor is more likely. So it is unjust to presume negligence on his part. The generic rule of Article 1265 is that if the thing is lost while in the possession of the debtor, it shall be presumed that the loss was due to his fault, unless there is proof to the contrary. However, if the obligor delays, or has promised to deliver the same thing to two or more persons who do not have the same interest, he shall be responsible for any fortuitous event until he has effected the delivery, regardless of the presence of fault or negligence.
So the fifth article is Article 1266. States here that the debtor and obligations to do shall also be released when the prestation becomes legally or physically impossible without the fault of the obligor. So, for example, in this case is Trisha bound himself to construct a five-story building in favor of Martha, and construction will start on December 31, 2020. But on October 31, 2020, an ordinance was issued by the City Council limiting the construction of a building up to two-story only due to the condition of the soil in the city. Hence, the obligation of Trisha becomes physically impossible. Therefore, ang obligation ni Trisha to construct a five-story building is extinguished.
Article 1267 states that when the service has become so difficult as to be manifestly beyond the contemplation of the parties, the obligor may also be released therefrom in whole or in part. So, the general rule is that the impossibility of the performance releases the obligor. This is also referred to as doctrine of frustration of the commercial object or frustration of enterprise. This article refers to moral impossibility or impracticability due to change of certain conditions. Take note that this article speaks of service, a personal obligation, not a real obligation which is to give.
So, ang ika-7 nga article sa Section 2, Laws of the Thing Due, is Article 1268. So, it states here that when the death of a thing certain and determinate proceeds from a criminal offense, the debtor shall not be exempted from the payment of its price, whatever may be the cause for the loss, unless the thing have been offered by him to the person who should receive it, the latter refused without justification to accept it. So, money effects sa laws in criminal offenses. So, it states here nga, if ma-proceed daw into criminal offense, dili ma-exempted ang debtor sa liabilities, whatever the cause of the loss. So, it's even without his fault or bisan pag it's due to fortuitous event. But take note that nasa exemption. So, ang nakastate dire is, unless the thing have been offered by him to the person who should receive it, the latter refuse without justification to accept it. So, ang example ingani nga scenario is, Chris stole Mary's car. So, nanay obligation si Chris nga i-deliver ang car dito ni Mary, but before ma-return ang car, nasunog ang bay ni Chris and naapil ang sakyanan. So, ang pangutana, is Chris' obligation extinguished? So, the answer is no, because ang obligation to deliver the car arose from the criminal offense. Pero, ang example po nga ning exemption, or ang exemption dere sa Article 1268 is, if kintahay wala gi-accept ni Mary ang pag-deliver sa sakyanan or ang sakyanan, mora ni ang exemption. So again, effect of the obligation proceed from a criminal law. Ang general rule ingani is, the debtor shall not be exempted from the payment of the price of the determinate thing, whatever may be the cause for the loss. Thus, even if the cause for the loss of the determinate thing is through fortuitous event.
Article 1269 states that the obligation having been extinguished by the loss of the thing, the creditor shall have all the rights of action which the debtor may have against third person by reason of the loss. Although the obligation is extinguished by loss of a thing, without the debtor's fault, nevertheless, whatever action the debtor may have against the third person by reason of the loss transferred to the creditor in order to safeguard the interest of the latter. The right of action includes the insurance indemnity that may have been received from the third person. And by the way, what is right of action? Right of action is a right to bring a specific case to the court.